Good evening and welcome to the fifth and final webinar in our series for education professionals, Positive and Proactive Supports for Challenging Behavior Associated with Tourette Syndrome and Co-occurring Conditions. My name is Angela Sullivan, Manager of Programs, and I will be your moderator this evening. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During the webinar, we'd be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You may ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. This webinar has been accredited for 1 contact hour for psychologists and social workers. For more information on how to claim your credit for your participation, please download the Learner Notification document that is located in the Handouts section of the control panel. In order to receive your certificate, you must participate in the entire webinar and follow the instructions on that document. You'll also receive a follow-up email within an hour after the webinar closes with additional detailed instructions. The slides for the presentation, along with a few of the TA's educational toolkits, are also available for download in the Handouts section. Before we get started, I did want to briefly introduce our speaker this evening. Kathy Giordano has been a Tourette education specialist since 2003. She has a background in teaching grade 7 through 12 English and was the coordinator for the Tourette Education and Support Program from 1995 to 2014 at the Advocacy Center in Rochester, New York. Additionally, Kathy owned and operated Tourette Plus, providing educational and behavioral consultant services to school districts and human service agencies. For over 30 years, she has presented internationally regarding Tourette syndrome, functional behavioral assessments, and positive, proactive behavioral management plans. Thanks so much for being here tonight, Kathy, and without further ado, you can go ahead with your presentation.
All right, thanks, Angela. So we're going to be talking about positive and proactive supports for challenging behaviors associated with Tourette and the co-occurring conditions. Over the 30 years, I've talked to a lot of schools, a lot of parents, and supported a lot of kids with Tourette and a lot of different kind of challenging behaviors. And I really wish I could say, I wish I had a bulleted list that says, okay, here's what you do. Here's the answer. Here's how you work with a student that has challenging behaviors. But I can't do that because it really isn't possible. Kids with Tourette are very, very complex, and they're all different. So how we support them when they do have challenging behaviors is through knowing them, knowing what's happening with them, and sort of being a detective, trying to figure out why they're having challenging behaviors. Because I'm in the world of Ross Green and Mona Delahooke that talks about kids really wanting to be successful if they can. So I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that I think is important to be aware of, as well as some examples of how we can support them in a positive and proactive way. So the basics of Tourette really quick. It is neurological. It's a medical disorder. It's not emotional. It is dependent on some of the chemicals in the brain, the dopamine and the serotonin. And when I first started doing presentations over 30 years ago, nobody had heard of dopamine or serotonin. But now, because of commercials and advertisements for anti-anxiety, we certainly know about serotonin, and most of us have heard of dopamine. So it's really the chemicals in the brain that are impacted with Tourette. It's important to recognize that all symptoms, all of the symptoms are due to physiological urges. If we can keep that in mind, that it's urges, it's not that these kids want to do these things. It's that they have really strong urges that are really difficult to ignore, and they're not intended to be intrusive, disruptive, or offensive. Obviously, all of us have urges, and I think as kids get tired, usually the symptoms get worse toward the end of the day because of fatigue and not being able to manage those urges as easily. So it's similar to, like, we have urges to blink or to clear our throat or to scratch an itch. I always like to compare symptoms to an itch that's on a part of your body that you're not supposed to be touching in public. So you can suppress it to an extent, but it's in your brain, it's there, and it's annoying and doesn't necessarily go away even though you're trying to ignore it. Performing tics really only provide temporary relief, so it's similar to scratching that itch. So I know a lot of people will say, schedule times for kids to go and do their tics. That may be helpful for some kids, but it's not really helpful for the majority of kids, because the tics, it may be helpful to go out and have a burst of tics, but that doesn't mean when you come back into the classroom that you're not going to have more urges to do more tics. So it's difficult. We do know that stress increases anxiety, and anxiety increases tics and all of the co-occurring symptoms as well as behaviors. So what we try to help people to see is to recognize what's making a child anxious. When is the child most likely to be anxious, and how can we reduce that anxiety? Because the more we reduce anxiety, the less the symptoms are going to be disruptive. And one of the things that really helps in reducing anxiety is that everyone knows about the Tourette. So having the classmates know that a child has Tourette and explaining it in a positive way can help the child. It actually reduces the symptoms, because if the child is coming to school and can say to themselves, okay, everybody knows I have Tourette, everybody knows I do these tics, so anxiety is less. If they're walking into a situation where nobody knows that they have Tourette, and the symptoms are going to be stared at and laughed at and made fun of, that increases anxiety. So the more people can be aware of Tourette, the less the symptoms are going to be. So the nature of symptoms, these are some of the things that make it really, really difficult. And you'll notice throughout the presentations, I will say a lot of the words typically and sometimes and often and many, because every kid with Tourette is different, and their symptoms are different. And even within the child themselves, their symptoms change. So there's naturally waxing and waning of symptoms, which we try to figure out, but can't really put our finger on it necessarily. Sometimes you can figure it out a little bit, but they just naturally get worse and they get better. They change in appearance and frequency, and they change in severity and intensity. So it makes it look like the kid has control over them. So if the tics are quiet, then we think that the child is controlling the symptoms. And then when the symptoms come back, it appears that now they're not controlling them. Where in reality, it is neurologically controlled, and it waxes and wanes, and the severities change in intensity. Sometimes the symptoms will be quiet, and sometimes they'll be more so. It just gives the appearance that they have control over the symptoms when they really, really do not. It may or may not worsen during adolescence. I know for a long time, we at the Tourette Association said that it does get worse in adolescence, but I've known a lot of kids that have had pretty significant symptoms prior to adolescence, and when they get into their teens, sometimes the symptoms will quiet down somewhat. And oftentimes, they will subside more in late adolescence. And I'm not sure if that has a lot to do with the chemistry that's going on in the child, if it has to do with the fact that they're going to be graduating from school and having maybe some more control over their life, that stress and anxiety is less. They can sometimes be absent for short periods of time. So a child may not have any symptoms for like a month, and we think, oh my God, he's cured. But then they come back, and that's semi-normal if there's, if we can use normal. They may vary significantly from one student to another. Unfortunately, what we have found at the Tourette Association is when we work with a specific student, what tends to happen is that some of the things we say, people will generalize that to all kids that have Tourette. And please don't do that, because every kid is different. Every child responds differently to supports. So since every child is different, we really need to be creative in helping each child. So, suppression, sometimes it can be helpful, but it's not always an effective strategy. So it's similar to kind of suppressing that urge to scratch. Like if you've got an itch on your back and you try to suppress the need to scratch it, it can increase the student's frustration and impact concentration, and oftentimes increase anger if they're suppressing really strong urges. So the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, estimates that 86% of people diagnosed with Tourette also have other diagnoses. This is really important because for 30 years, I have tried to educate the world that Tourette is more than tics. Unfortunately, people talk about Tourette, they talk about tics. I talk about symptoms because yes, tics are part of the symptoms of Tourette, but the symptoms of ADD, of anxiety, of learning difficulties, speech and language, and more than a third of the people with Tourette have an obsessive compulsive disorder or obsessive compulsive behavior symptoms, which in my experience, obsessive compulsiveness really oftentimes is the reason for the challenging behaviors. 25% have some rage issues, and this is Dr. Kathy Budman is world renowned for dealing with people with Tourette and strong behavioral issues, rage issues. And she has said that in her experience, she believes that about 25% of the people that do have Tourette have some kind of rage issues. And the majority of people have handwriting issues. A lot of difficulties getting thoughts from the brain to the paper. It can be copying from the board, it can be answering questions, it can be copying from a book. But an awful lot of people with Tourette are very bright and know a lot and have a lot of creative thoughts, but have difficulties getting those thoughts from the brain to the paper. So any kind of strategies that we can help a student with in doing this will reduce the anxiety. When people call me and tell me that there's a child that has some challenging behaviors, one of the first things I ask is, does he have difficulties with handwriting? Because imagine being really bright and knowing information, but not being able to express it. And so the world doesn't see you as being as bright as you are. Very frustrating. So the famous Iceberg. This has helped a lot of people have a better concept of Tourette because we can hear the motor tics. We can hear the vocal tics, and we can see the motor tics. So that's kind of the tip of the iceberg, but it's the things that are underneath the iceberg that are oftentimes more disruptive than the tics themselves. And I say that, often, because there are people that have major difficulties with tics and maybe some minimal difficulties with the underlying comorbids. But a lot of people that are having challenging behaviors, particularly because they're misunderstood, may have mild motor tics and vocal tics. So we don't see them as really having a bad case of Tourette, but they have major handwriting issues, obsessive compulsive, social communication deficits, attention deficit, sleep issues is huge, anxiety, impulsivity, difficulties transitioning, executive function deficits is huge for people with Tourette syndrome. And oftentimes the rage. So if you're working with a student that has Tourette, be aware of the vocal tics and the motor tics. And obviously, one of the things that we most suggest for vocal tics and motor tics is to ignore them as much as we can. But be aware that it's the other difficulties underneath the iceberg that may be causing the main difficulties for the child. So as I said, it is neurodevelopmental. Symptoms are typically noticed when the child is about between 5 and 7. They typically, and again, it's the typically, it's the most, it's the some, typically increase between 8 and 12. Many people with Tourette have improvement in late adolescence. And some adults have significantly reduced symptoms. But I hear all the time angry adults who are saying that everybody thinks that the symptoms go away when you become an adult. Lots of times they do not. Lots of times the tics continue, as do the co-occurring difficulties. So, we really need to get rid of that idea that when people become adults, that the symptoms go away. For many people, they're reduced, but for a lot of people, they are not. And so about a quarter of the people with Tourette continue to have the persistent symptoms into adulthood, which can be very bothersome. This is a slide that is particularly disturbing to me because it gives the numbers. So 1 out of every 160 children, and these are numbers from the Center for Disease Control. So 1 in 160, we believe, has Tourette or some kind of a tic disorder. No, 1 in 60 have Tourette, whereas 1 in 100 have either Tourette or a chronic tic disorder. Obviously, you can have motor tics without having vocal tics, so you wouldn't have Tourette. So a lot of people do have a tic disorder, which is, the kissing cousin of Tourette, and so probably they will have co-occurring difficulties as well. But the really disturbing thing is that the CDC estimates that 50% of the people that have Tourette go undiagnosed. Trying to help a student that has Tourette, knowing that they have Tourette, is difficult. But these kids that aren't diagnosed that have Tourette, these are the kids that I really grieve for, because they will have a lot of trouble. They will get blamed. They will be looked at as doing things on purpose. So the more you can learn about Tourette syndrome so that we can get these kids diagnosed, the better it will be for everyone. So disinhibition is really important as far as Tourette goes. And Rose Woods wrote a book a while back about Tourette being a disability of disinhibition, and I liked her definitions. It's a condition in people with primary neurological disorders that limit a person's ability to use his inhibitory process and learned inhibitory skills. Now, the important part of that is that they know right from wrong. They're not able to inhibit their learned skills. So a lot of times we think, well, this kid, has these behaviors, so we just need to teach them how to do something different. They don't want to do these behaviors. They know right from wrong. It's just that in the moment, they're not able to inhibit the urges that they're feeling, or the thoughts that they're thinking, the emotions that they're feeling. So it can end up with a lot of different difficulties, movements, behaviors, swearing, inappropriate comments, emotional outbursts, rage, infantile behaviors, noises, faces, laughter. I mean, it can go on and on and on. I had a school nurse write me one time and asked me for a list of every possible tic a kid could have. Well, that's impossible. So this is a diagram of the brain, and I have a son with very severe Tourette, and he was diagnosed back in 1990. And even way back then, I used to be an English teacher, so I do research. And even back then, we knew that the basal ganglia was impacted. And this diagram is not, I didn't put in the red words there that says it's the basal ganglia that chooses which actions to perform at the moment. So it's the brain has an urge, and it goes to the basal ganglia. Now, we who don't have Tourette, or we're able to inhibit, the basal ganglia will say, no, that's not a good idea. You don't want to do that right now. For people with Tourette, the basal ganglia, the brakes don't work. The basal ganglia doesn't, if it's not functioning properly, it doesn't help the person know when to inhibit and when not to inhibit. And so lots of times the behavior just occurs. So if we really can remember that it's the basal ganglia, and it's the difficulty inhibiting behaviors that they know are wrong and that they don't want to do, I think that helps us in figuring out how to help children. Now, a lot of times people get disinhibition and impulsivity confused. And I have seen this to be really, really important during manifestation determination meetings, because people will say, well, I know it wasn't part of the disorder because they thought about it. Well, disinhibition, again, is the inability to inhibit behaviors in the moment. But it can last a long time. So something can happen to somebody in the morning, and it stays in their head all day long, and they finally can't inhibit it anymore, and so they will do it. And unfortunately, a lot of the symptoms of Tourette are suggestible. So once we've planted the thought, it's difficult for them to inhibit. So if you're with somebody and you're talking face to face, and all of a sudden they kind of look around you and they say, wow, don't look now, you're going to really want to look. It may be really hard for you to inhibit. Different than impulsivity. Impulsivity is responding quickly before you think about it. So it's the Dennis the Menace type of thing. By the time I thought about whether I should or I shouldn't, I already did. So it's important to recognize the difference between impulsivity and disinhibition. And of course, kids with Tourette that also have attention deficit may also have difficulties with impulsivity. So the disinhibition is really important because it really determines how we're going to respond to the child's behavior. So is it support or punishment? So the little boy says, I hate writing, it's stupid. Do we send them to timeout, or do we give them assistive technology? Do we support or do we punish? Punish isn't going to work. It's not going to teach. Giving them support, giving them positive and proactive support is what works. Reactive, punitive does not work because it's not going to change the neurology. So there was a little girl in 4th grade, and the teacher called me one day and she says, okay, this is not Tourette, because every time I say we're going to have a test or a quiz, she says, shut up. And I said, well, see, everybody else in the class is thinking shut up or worse. They're able to inhibit it. She's not able to inhibit it. So what did we do? We talked to the little girl, and we got her to, instead of saying shut up, she got to a place where she could clear her throat loudly. And we got the teacher to agree that that's okay. So coming up with creative strategies to help these kids is the answer. The disinhibition, it can result in emotional dysregulation, and it can end up being angry, it can end up being rage, but I've also seen kids with Tourette syndrome that become silly. And it's almost harder for us to understand, because we can understand, you know, getting angry over something, getting really silly, but if it's the basal ganglia that's not working quite right, the silliness can kick in too. The Tourette Association just had an excellent webinar, Emotional Overload, Understanding Non-Tic Behaviors. I've listed the link in the resources. I strongly, if you're interested in this webinar, I would strongly recommend that you watch that webinar, because it gives a lot of scientific good information. So the disinhibition can also impact the co-occurring disorders, so the obsessive compulsive disorders. You know, we may be able to control the obsessive compulsive for a bit, but when the disinhibition kicks in, then the obsessive compulsive may go crazy. Sensory issues. I can't not stop touching this. I've got to touch it. I've got to touch it. Tics, obviously, and the emotional regulations. Inappropriate comments. This is hard because it sounds purposeful, it looks purposeful. If you're blurting out something, or if you're calling somebody a name, or if you're repeating what others say, it really looks purposeful. But if it's in your head, you know, that this person, you know, has a red shirt on and doesn't look good, you may blurt it out. Hey, why do you have that red shirt on? Again, you got to look at the disinhibition. And unfortunately, some people with Tourette, they have touching socially inappropriately. I was talking to a social worker a few years back, and she was working with a 9th grade boy who touched females inappropriately. And they worked on this during the summer, and what they came up with was he was able to, when he had the urge to touch somebody, he would put his hands behind his back and hold his own hands, and that eventually satisfied his urge. So learning strategies on how to satisfy an urge that is really socially inappropriate is very difficult, but is a way to manage symptoms that can be helpful. So why is it important to understand why a kid is having challenging behaviors? Ross Green, again, if you're watching this webinar, I strongly encourage you to check out Ross Green, Lives in the Balance. It's a great website. And I've been a follower of Ross Green since my son was about 8 years old, when I first heard him say, it's your explanation of the behavior that leads directly to how you respond to it. It's your explanation of the behavior. So if my explanation for my son saying something really inappropriate to me, if my explanation is he's being rude, I will probably punish. But if my explanation is that it's part of his Tourette, then I'm going to be more likely to try to offer support or ignore it when I can. So once upon a time, a man whose axe was missing suspected his neighbor's son. The boy walked like a thief, he looked like a thief, and he spoke like a thief. But the man found his axe while digging in the valley, and the next time he saw his neighbor's son, the boy walked, looked, and spoke like any other child. It's our explanation that leads directly to how we respond to it. We tend to jump to conclusions or make assumptions. So recognize that it's how important our explanation is to how we respond. And actually, the federal government agreed with us that Tourette syndrome is a neurological condition. And when IDEA was reauthorized in 2004, they included Tourette under other health impaired. And whenever a law is changed, they have to write why they changed it. And this was the explanation that the federal government wrote for including Tourette under other health impaired. We believe that Tourette syndrome is commonly misunderstood to be behavioral or emotional condition rather than neurological. Therefore, including Tourette and other health impaired may help correct the misperception of Tourette syndrome as behavioral or conduct disorder. And this is what I love: prevent the misdiagnosis of their needs. What do they need? Do they need to be sent out into the hallway, or do they need maybe some sensory supports? Do they need to be stay after school for not being able to finish their homework, or do they need somebody to help them with executive functioning difficulties? What are their needs? This is, I just love this, that they did this. So this is just, I'm going to go through this quickly because this is kind of how some kids' days go. This is how difficult it is for some kids to have Tourette. So a lot of kids have the executive functioning, and then they have the disinhibition, and then they have the sensory integration difficulties, and they also have some obsessive compulsive difficulties. Well, then you put them together, and the executive functioning and the OCD results in a matter of wanting to be perfect, having some rituals, and feeling defeated. The disinhibition and the ADD may result in inappropriate comments, emotions, joking, the sensory integration, the social skills deficits, and inappropriate behaviors. The sensory integration and the obsessive compulsive, they must touch something perfectly. They can't wear socks. They often need to hurt themselves. And then they've got the tics. You know, they've not only got all these co-occurring things that are going on in their day, but they've got the tics that they try to control. So they're putting energy into suppressing symptoms. And unfortunately, it oftentimes will end up in total frustration, giving up, anger, and sometimes rage, and some challenging behaviors. So if a kid is having some challenging behaviors, try to tease it out. Find out what's happening. And it's difficult because the kid won't know. You know, we ask a child, well, you know, why did you do that? And the child's not going to say, well, I don't know, my serotonin and my dopamine was, you know, kind of out of balance. So being a detective and being somebody in the kid's life that is positive to help them, and that they know that you're trying to help and trying to have some positive impact. One of the things, like I said before, the obsessive compulsive oftentimes is responsible for challenging behaviors. And Dr. Heather Adams explained to me one day the difference between obsessive compulsive disorder and Tourette obsessive compulsive behaviors. Classically, OCD are linked to rituals, managing some anxiety related to the obsessions. But she stated that in Tourette, the symptoms overlap more closely with the experience of tics. So a lot of times the obsessive compulsive behaviors with Tourette is similar to tics because the behavior is driven by an urge rather than a fear. So if you've got a child with Tourette syndrome and they don't have a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, they may have Tourette obsessive compulsive behaviors, which can be just as interfering as having the obsessive compulsive disorder. So, there's a lot of medications for obsessive compulsive disorder. Does it help for kids that have Tourette obsessive compulsiveness? Sometimes, but medications is very, very complex. So how can we help? And I've got a picture of a detective because when I used to help schools, and as a consultant now, I'm returning to helping schools with functional behavioral assessments and positive intervention plans. I always put my detective hat on because I know the kid wants to do well. I know the kid is probably smart, probably talented, wants to be successful. So what's going on? How can we help the child? The first thing we need to do is consider, are we making assumptions? Because we all make assumptions about a lot of things. We like easy answers. So making the assumption, well, he's very smart, so I know he knows what he's doing. He's just lazy. That's an easy answer that may not be the true answer. She's purposefully disruptive, sarcastic, rude, inconsiderate. Again, giving the explanation that she's doing it purposefully is the easy explanation, but may not be the correct explanation. And what I hear a ton is that the behavior is attention seeking. I got to tell you, kids with Tourette syndrome get way more attention than they want. So typically kids with Tourette are not doing things to get attention. I know it looks like that sometimes because other kids in the class will laugh. Well, kids with Tourette, they want to have friends. They want to be popular just like everybody else. So sometimes if their symptoms cause other people to laugh, then the child themselves may smile and it may look like they're doing it on purpose. But as I said, kids with Tourette typically don't want more attention. Instead, we need to be curious and to have an environment that the child sees as being helpful and not punishing. Kids with Tourette are punish, 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 punish. And so if they come to an environment that they really, really are convinced is trying to help them, it makes a tremendous difference in the anxiety and the amount of symptoms. Lots of times a designated person will be the trusted person that the child can speak with. And this person, disagreeing with the kid is not a good idea because the child's reality is their reality. Instead, trying to figure out strategies, listening to the child and helping the child figure out a strategy on how to do something different. Another link that I think is really important is Dr. Ross Green's assessment of lagging skills, because what we need to look at, and if you are, counselors and school psychologists out there, looking at the skills, what skills are they lagging in? And is this what is frustrating them and causing some challenging behaviors? So some common strategies that typically don't help. Punishment is way up there. So if you've got a behavioral plan based on consequences, punishment, it's not going to help. It can help kids that have control over their behaviors, but it's not going to help kids with neurological urges. It doesn't help. It doesn't teach them. It doesn't teach other strategies. And punishment will most likely increase the anger, and it certainly destroys trust between the child and the person. Timeout and suspensions, obviously all of these things are going to increase anxiety, which is going to increase symptoms. There was one I heard recently where a child would not get on the bus, and so one of the people from the school went to the child and said, "You either get on that bus or we're going to call the police." not a surprise that didn't work. Helping, trying to figure out what's going on rather than the punishment. And the contracts they don't work on a long-term basis either. And even rewards don't always work because rewards can increase anxiety. So you've got a point system that's resulting in a reward. Oh man, am I going to get that reward? Am I going to get that reward? I've got to do this. It's going to increase anxiety. Stickers don't necessarily teach anything. And the green light, yellow light, red light. I mean, you talk about putting a person in a situation that's going to increase anxiety. That's it. Now, I have heard of some children that will do their own green light, yellow light. And when they get into the yellow light, parents and teachers know that, okay, things are not going right. We need to do something to help them get back into the green light. And reminding a person not to do something, it just increases the disinhibition. Personally, I have a problem with signs that say wet paint, keep off. I am going to touch that bench to see if it's really wet paint. So when we remind a person not to do something, we're setting the seed, making it more difficult for them to inhibit. So anxiety, as I've been saying all along, anxiety is going to increase the symptoms. So the minute anxiety arises, intelligence closes to search for anything that will relieve that anxiety. And a lot of times that results in some difficult behaviors. So one of the things that we really look at for to reduce the anxiety and to help kids with anxiety is to teach them that they have an anxiety vase. And as the vase gets fuller during the day, so they're doing their tics, they've got anxiety over a test, they've got challenges over something that they're not good at, they're being bullied, attempts to suppress their anxiety vase is getting fuller and fuller and fuller until it overflows. And when it does overflow, unfortunately, what we tend to do is look at what happened immediately prior to the challenging behavior. What we have to do is instead look at the child as having this emotional vase and how can we reduce the vase during the day so that it's less likely to overflow. And teaching the child to be aware of their vase. What is their physical feelings? What's happening with them? So that they can also recognize how to reduce that vase. And one of the things that's very, 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 very helpful and overlooked when we're thinking about positive and proactive interventions for kids that have challenging behaviors, please, please, please encourage their talents and their interests. As I've said, many, many kids with Tourette are bright and talented in certain areas. And the more we can encourage that interest and talent, the better self-esteem they're going to have, which is going to end up reducing anxiety. So a middle school teacher once said to me, don't ever tell them what you like. They're either going to take it away or make you earn it. Instead, encourage it. Don't use their talent or their interest as a carrot or a punishment. Encourage it. If we think of it as a balance, because these kids have a lot of difficulties, and if we can balance it by their strengths, then they're going to be much more successful, much less anxious, and symptoms are going to be much, much better. This actually is my teacher. That's my son, Matt. He was diagnosed at the age of 5. And I love this quote, every adult needs a child to teach. It's how we adults learn. I learned a ton from Matthew. And as a parent back in the 1990s, everybody was encouraging me to punish him. It took me a while, but he definitely taught me that punishing him was not going to be successful. And that's when I started doing more research and trying to be more positive and proactive. He is a drummer. He has been a drummer since day one. We have encouraged it. He's now president of Drum Echoes Incorporated. He has developed Echo Life, which it's a device to help people with Tourette reduce anxiety. He was in 75 Watts. It's an award-winning documentary. He's doing very well, even though as a youngster he had severe rage. And he actually talks about what it's like to have childhood rage with that link. So there's a lot of resources. It's the emotional overload, which I talked about. Dr. Budman has videos on explosive behaviors. There's a great resource called Classroom Behavior Management. It talks about, it very well talks about the difference between punishment and support, and the difference between neurological and emotional difficulties. It's a really good resource. We have the Educator's Toolkit, which is also excellent. And Tourette is more than tics, little lengthy, but you can sort through it and look at what you want to look at, and it gives information on a lot of the co-occurring difficulties. And the education resource page on the Tourette website has a lot of articles that are appropriate for parents and teachers. And there again is Matt's childhood rage video. Oops. So I went a little past my time, but if anybody has any questions, I'll turn it back over to Angela.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathy. You were right on time. That's perfect timing. Okay,
I'm a little obsessive compulsive myself about it.
It's okay, perfect. So thank you so much for such an excellent presentation. Lots of great information that you shared. As she mentioned, we're now going to begin answering questions that were submitted during the presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane in the control panel. We have some time, so feel free to get those questions in. If we are unable to get to everyone's questions here at the TAA, we do have a full-time information and referral staff who would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, and you can do so by emailing support@tourette.org or giving us a call at 1-888-4-TOURETTE. Okay, Kathy, there are a few questions. So first question, does physiological stress act the same way as cognitive stress on the frequency of tics or physiological hyperstimulation?
So I'm assuming I'm assuming that you mean physiological stress as like if the person is tired or if the person the body is stressed in some way. And I'm thinking that's what you mean. I learned from Ross Green years and years and years ago that any kind of stress is going to increase symptoms. So if the child is hungry, you're likely to see increased symptoms. If the child is thirsty, if the kid has, really, really warm. There was one girl that I was helping the school, and her aide said that, she says, I might be wrong, but I notice when she sits next to the heat that her tics are much increased. So, yeah, the physical environment definitely can impact symptoms.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. On the iceberg visual, are the factors listed underneath the water associated or co-occurring associated? I think there's a typo here, but we'll try and decipher. So on the iceberg visual, are the factors listed underneath the water associated or conditions that are an inherent part of TS?
Okay, they're not, obviously, if you have Tourette, you're not necessarily going to have all those conditions. Those are conditions that are common related to Tourette, and there are some people that rather than calling them related or co-occurring, there's a discussion that they should be really called comorbid, because as comorbid they impact each other. So if it's a co-occurring, you can have a cold and a broken foot, and that would be co-occurring. But if it's comorbid, then they're impacting each other. So No, you're not going to, all of those things underneath the iceberg aren't going to impact every child with Tourette. And some of them will be more impactful than others. And, I mean, you can have a kid with no obsessive compulsive behaviors, but huge executive function deficits. So yeah, it's just, we just list them as some of the common difficulties that co-occur with Tourette.
Perfect. Thank you. Do kids grow out of TS rage?
Oh, that's such a good question. Do they grow out of it? I think with I think when we respond to them in a way that's helpful, I don't know if they outgrow it necessarily. I mean, I think as you get older, yes, I see the rage get less and less as people get older and into adult, because they're better able to manage it. They're better able to recognize, when they might be getting close to having a rage, and figure out what they can do instead. Um, but that's just like everything else with Tourette, it depends. I think there probably are people that outgrow the rage symptom, but I also know that there are adults that continue to struggle with the rage. So I wouldn't say yes or no that they grow out of it. Like most things with Tourette, I guess I would say it depends. So but I think if we can help them in a positive way, I think then we're more likely for them to be able to manage it. And when I talk about Tourette symptoms, lots of times I never talk about controlling it or stopping it. I talk a lot about managing the symptoms. So as people get older, they learn how to manage the symptoms more.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. My son has about one rage attack per day at school. His school is recommending counseling, but the staff is not Tourette informed. Is there any advice about counseling for students with Tourette syndrome, good, bad, or indifferent?
Again, that depends. If the people that are doing the counseling are well versed in Tourette, it can be very, very helpful. If the people counseling are not familiar with Tourette, it can be actually detrimental. Because if you start counseling and saying things like, I know you can control this, you just need to try harder, that's not going to be helpful. But one of the things that we really strongly encourage is for schools to contact us, have a team meeting. It doesn't have to be necessarily a full presentation for the entire school, which would be nice. But a lot of times, if you have a team meeting, so the team of that particular student, even if it's just the counselor and the teacher, it doesn't matter how many people are there, ask us questions. So rather than giving a PowerPoint or an in-service, we answer the specific questions that the teachers ask. So for this parent, I would recommend that you let the school know that we're available to be on the phone or Zoom during a team meeting to answer their questions. We're not about telling them what to do, because every kid is different. What we want to do is listen to the team, listen to what they're saying, and then ask them some questions and help them do some strategizing. So the counseling, I'd strongly encourage that the counselor, at least the counselor, talk to somebody at the Tourette Association and get some of the resources that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. Okay, we have a few more questions. Do you have any advice for managing the impacts of the behavior, rage attack or an outburst, on other children? It can be very stressful for them to experience, and they also don't understand it's part of a neurobiological issue.
Yeah, it can be disturbing for other kids. that's why we really want to encourage letting the other kids know. We have a resource on the website. It's Educating Classmates. It's kind of a long title. I can't remember it, but it's something about educating classmates step by step, which is a really good resource. So letting other kids know, and kids can be very, very understanding. Kids now know about allergies and about asthma and about different type of difficulties. So, and again, if the other kids know, then that may cut down on the severity of the response of the child with Tourette. But other than that, I mean, there are times when, I mean, we encourage everything to be ignored, but there are times when it really is totally disruptive, and the child may need to go to a safe place. And what a lot of schools are doing now is using like a Zoom. And boy, if we certainly know how to do that now from this past year. So the kid may be able to go someplace and still be engaged with the class, but not, have his speaker off, so he is not disruptive. But that's only under really, really, really extreme situations. Usually, if we educate the other classmates, this helps a great deal, and give the kid, maybe he needs some sensory, he needs, to have a sensory break, or whatever can help the child too to have less disruptive behaviors. But yeah, I get it. It can be disruptive to other kids.
Okay. All right. We have 2 more questions. First one, if a child had a diagnosis of ADHD, Tourette syndrome, and OCD, would you address symptoms or address the executive functions of ADHD first, or ... What are your thoughts?
I guess my thoughts are whatever would be most helpful. If executive functioning is huge, so but I can't say because I don't know the kid. This would be a situation where a team meeting might be helpful, because we could learn more about specifics of the child, and so then we could give more advice on what you need to focus on. So it's really hard to because we don't really know the kid.
Okay, no problem. If whoever asked that question has a follow-up question, feel free to type it in, or you can always reach out to us after. Okay, and the last question.
And reach out to us for a team meeting, because I'd be more than happy to have a conversation, or just a conversation. It doesn't even have to be a team, just a one-on-one conversation.
Yep. Okay, the last question that I have, and if you can't answer it, just let me know. I might be able to chime in, because it's kind of broad. I've been asked to direct my workplace's neurodiversity resource department. Where do I start?
You can take it, Angela.
Okay, so we actually at the TAA are working to develop presentations and things for companies for this particular topic. So whoever answered this question, please email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I can connect you with somebody who can come to your organization or company and give a presentation on Tourette syndrome and neurodiverse conditions, and we would be more than happy to provide you with any resources, whether it's for other employees, whether it's for an employee with Tourette syndrome, and things like that. So we would definitely be happy to help you out. So I'm typing in my email. So feel free to email me and share some additional information so we can get you what you need. Okay, actually, one more question. So the same person who asked the other question, Kathy, is wondering if we provide information to Canadian schools. And I don't think the answer is no. So.
You think the answer is what?
I don't think the answer is no.
Yeah, no, I don't think the answer is no either, because I've talked to people in Italy and Yugoslavia, and so yes, we would be happy to Although Canada does have a great Tourette association.
Yes, they do.
But
So
we
feel
would
free
be.
to reach out to us, and we can definitely get you any resources that you need. Okay, Kathy, that looks like that's all the questions that we have. So thank you again for a great presentation, a lot of great questions and answers. This is all the time we have for the webinar. For those of you still on, once the webinar is closed, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would be greatly appreciative if you would complete that and provide your feedback. This survey is specific to your experience during the webinar and will help us to improve future programming. You'll also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of the webinar. And there will also be additional instructions for those of you who are interested in claiming CE credits for your live participation this evening. Additionally, the webinar will be posted on the TAA's YouTube channel for anyone who was unable to participate today. We encourage you to reach out to us about this webinar or for any other ideas and suggestions that you may have. On behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to view the presentation. Thank you again, Kathy, for a great presentation, and hope you all have a great night.
Thanks, Angela.